Hello, have a nice December evening. Welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. Today is a story full of Christmas spirit. We're in a small, peaceful town. Christmas turns into a slightly scary experience. So sit back and let's begin. We decided to spend Christmas with my girlfriend's parents in their small, picturesque town nestled at the base of a mountain range. The moment we arrived, I was struck by the town's old-world charm. Snow blanketed the sloping rooftops, and strings of warm, twinkling lights stretched across narrow streets. It was the kind of place that seemed pulled from a Christmas card, where time moved slower, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Her parents greeted us with open arms and ushered us into their cozy home, where a crackling fireplace set the tone for the evening. We spent the first night curled up in the living room, sipping mugs of rich hot cocoa and sharing stories by the soft glow of the tree's lights. Despite the idyllic surroundings, the silence outside was palpable. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the countryside, but a deep, almost stifling stillness. I brushed it off as my city ears adjusting to the change. By the next morning, the festive spirit was in full bloom. Her parents bustled about, setting up for a grand Christmas dinner, their cheerful banner filling the house. The scent of roasting meat and freshly baked pies wafted through the air, making my mouth water. As they prepared the meal, my girlfriend suggested we take a stroll through the town, stretch our legs, and soak in the wintry charm. I happily agreed, eager to explore. Bundling up against the cold, we stepped outside into the crisp air. Snow crunched softly beneath our boots as we made our way down the winding lanes. The streets were unusually empty, with just the occasional bundled-up figure passing by, their breath misting in the cold. We exchanged polite nods with the few residents we encountered, their expressions warm but fleeting, as if they were eager to return indoors. The deeper into the town we ventured, the more the quiet pressed down on us. The charm began to feel uncanny, the stillness to complete. My girlfriend pointed out the intricate wooden carvings on door frames and the delicate ice patterns forming on lampposts, but I found my eyes drawn toward the dense forest in the distance. It loomed at the edge of the town like a black and white painting, stark and foreboding against the snow-covered ground. My curiosity stirred as we headed toward it. The closer we got, the more the town seemed to fade into the background. The air grew colder, sharper, and the faint sounds of civilization disappeared entirely. As the trees swallowed us, the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of our steps in the snow. It felt as though we had stepped into another world, one far removed from the cheerful Christmas cheer we had left behind. The forest was hauntingly beautiful. Snow draped the tall pines, and the ground shimmered with a crystalline frost. The world felt muffled, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. As we walked deeper, my initial fascination began to waver, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of branches under the weight of the snow. I glanced at my girlfriend and noticed her frown as her eyes darted around, scanning the dense trees. I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Still, I convinced myself it was all in my head. After all, this was just a serene winter walk, a perfect prelude to Christmas dinner. At least, that's what I kept telling myself as we moved deeper into the shadows of the forest. The forest, nestled at the base of the towering mountain, was hauntingly beautiful in its wintry stillness. The tall pines, their branches heavy with snow, created a canopy that cast long, jagged shadows over the glistening ground. Each step we took seemed to disturb the perfect quiet, our boots crunching through the thick, untouched layer of frost. The air was sharp and biting, the kind that made your breath hang in front of you like smoke. Everything about the forest felt suspended in time, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. As we ventured deeper, an uneasiness began to creep in, subtle at first, but growing with every step. The stillness was shattered when we heard it. A faint clinking sound, metallic and unnatural, drifting through the trees. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as we strained our ears, each clink hitting with a strange, deliberate rhythm. My girlfriend stopped in her tracks, her hand gripping mine tightly as we exchanged a tense glance. The sound seemed to echo all around us, impossible to pin down. It was a strange, hollow noise, like chains being dragged across ice. A chill crept down my spine, and I couldn't help but scan the treetops and shadows for its source. Before either of us could say anything, the forest exploded with sound. A deafening blast echoed off the mountains, reverberating through the ground and knocking the air out of my lungs. The snow beneath us trembled as if something massive had shifted deep within the earth. My girlfriend clung to my arm, her wide eyes darting in every direction. My heart raced as we stood frozen, too stunned to move or speak. The forest fell silent again, but not in the way it had been before. This was a heavy, oppressive silence, as though the explosion had stolen every sound, even the wind. Just as we were about to turn back, to abandon the eerie woods altogether, movement caught my eye. A small figure stumbled toward us, the sound of its hurried footsteps breaking the quiet. It was a boy, no older than 10, his face pale and streaked with tears. He was trembling, his clothes in tatters, as if he had been running for hours. He stumbled forward and grabbed my coat, his hands icy cold even through the fabric. The boy's voice was ragged, his sobs punctuated by gasps for air. He kept repeating the same phrase, almost chanting through his desperation, "They haven't committed any sins." Over and over, his voice cracked, trembling as if he were pleading for his life. I knelt to his level, trying to calm him down, to make sense of what he was saying. When I asked who he meant, his shaking hand slowly raised, pointing toward the mountain. My stomach sank as I followed his gaze. The pines thinned out near the foot of the mountain, revealing a dark opening in the rock face. From within, an unearthly red light glowed, pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of some immense, unseen force. It illuminated the snow around it, casting long, sinister shadows across the trees. Before I could process what I was seeing, I turned back to the boy, only to find him gone. My breath caught in my throat as I realized we were no longer alone. For snowmen, lifelike and grotesque, now stood where the boy had been, their round faces twisted into expressions of sheer terror. Their eyes, carved from stones, seemed to bore into me, their jagged mouths frozen in silent screams. The realization sent a bolt of cold terror through my chest, and my girlfriend's grip tightened on my arm as she whispered my name. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the snowmen, their sudden, inexplicable appearance more chilling than the frost biting at my skin. A fresh clinking of chains rang out, louder and closer this time, breaking the paralyzing spell and sending us both sprinting back toward the safety of the town. At the foot of the mountain was a sight that etched itself into my memory like a scar. A massive hole yawned at the base of the rocky crag, its jagged edges sharp and uneven as though they had been gouged out by an immense, unnatural force. The size of it was staggering, easily large enough to swallow a house, and from within its depths emanated a pulsing red light. It wasn't steady or comforting like the warm glow of a fire, but erratic, alive, almost as though it had its own heartbeat. The snow surrounding the hole reflected the sinister light, casting the entire scene in an eerie, hellish hue. My breath hitched as an unsettling warmth emanated from the opening, cutting through the freezing air. It wasn't a comforting warmth, but a suffocating one, thick and oppressive, making my skin prickle with unease. I stood there, transfixed, unable to tear my eyes away from the pulsating glow. It seemed to reach out, pulling me closer with every beat, and for a moment, I felt as though I were being drawn toward the void against my will. My girlfriend tugged on my arm, her voice shaking as she tried to get my attention, but I couldn't focus. The air around us had grown unnaturally still, every sound dampened except for the faint hum emanating from the hole. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, as though something deep within the cavernous maw was staring back at me, studying me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as a faint vibration underfoot reminded me of the explosion we'd heard earlier, as though the ground itself was alive with whatever was festering within that opening. Finally, I snapped out of my trance and turned back toward the boy, desperate to ask more questions, to understand what was happening, but the boy was gone. The realization hit me like a cold slap to the face, and my heart began to race. I hadn't heard him leave, hadn't seen him move. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. In his place, four snowmen now stood, arranged in a circle around the nearest trees. My stomach dropped as I stared at them. They hadn't been there before. Each one was disturbingly lifelike, their features carved with an unsettling precision. But it wasn't their sudden appearance that froze me in place. It was their faces. Every one of them was twisted into an expression of pure terror, their mouths agape as if frozen mid-scream. The black stones used for their eyes seemed to glisten in the red light, giving them a horrifyingly sentient quality My girlfriend's hand clamped around mine, her grip trembling but firm. She didn't have to say a word. Her wide eyes and pale face mirrored the panic building inside me. Without speaking, we turned and bolted back toward the town, our boots sinking into the deep snow with every frantic step. The sound of chains rattled again, louder this time, cutting through the oppressive silence like a warning. It was no longer a distant echo, but something dangerously close. Too close. The metallic clinking seemed to surround us, bouncing off the trees and filling the forest with its dreadful melody. I didn't dare look back. My chest burned as we ran, the freezing air tearing at my lungs. But fear pushed us forward. The forest that had once seemed serene now loomed around us, every shadow and shape a potential threat. Snow kicked up behind us as though the very ground were trying to slow our escape. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between us and that monstrous, glowing pit. By the time we stumbled out of the forest and into the edge of town, we were utterly spent. Each ragged breath seared my throat, the icy air cutting like shards of glass. The town looked the same as we had left it, but something about the stillness felt off. The streets were deserted, the snow undisturbed except for our hurried footprints. Warm light spilled out from behind drawn curtains, casting a golden glow onto the frosty ground. It was surreal, this picturesque quiet, as if the town itself had no idea of the terror lurking just beyond the tree line. We slowed our pace, the adrenaline still thrumming in our veins, as we tried to shake the oppressive fear clinging to us like a second skin. The sound of chains no longer followed us, but the weight of something unseen pressed heavily against my chest. As we approached her parents' house, the sight of the familiar structure felt like a lifeline. The soft glow of their Christmas lights flickered gently in the night, a beacon of safety. The snow beneath our boots crunched in an oddly loud rhythm, every sound amplified by the eerie silence. My girlfriend grabbed my hand, her grip still trembling, as we walked the final stretch. Above us, the moon hung low, its light casting long, comforting shadows across the snowy streets. For the first time since entering the forest, I let myself take a deep breath. But then, without warning, the light disappeared. It didn't dim or flicker, nor did it hide behind a passing cloud. It was as if someone had snuffed it out entirely. The streets were plunged into an unnatural darkness, leaving only the faint glimmer of the town's lights to guide us. We stopped, exchanging wide-eyed looks before turning in unison. My chest tightened as I followed her gaze upward. There, atop the town hall, was a figure that defied comprehension. Its silhouette stood stark against the dim backdrop of the sky, a towering monstrosity that seemed almost too large to balance on the roof's narrow ridgeline. Its horns curled upward like grotesque spirals, framing a head that seemed both beastly and man-like. The creature exuded an aura of malice so potent it felt suffocating. I could see the faint gleam of its glowing eyes, though its face was otherwise shrouded in shadow. The figure moved deliberately, taking 3 slow, calculated steps, each clack of its hooves against the roof tiles echoing through the empty streets like gunshots. The sound seemed to reverberate deep in my chest, paralyzing me with dread. In its massive clawed hand, the figure held a strange broom, its bristles gnarled and twisted as though they'd been ripped from the forest itself. It swung the broom in a deliberate, theatrical arc, and when it slammed the bristles against the roof tiles, the effect was immediate and terrifying. A cascade of sparks erupted in all directions, briefly illuminating the street below in a hellish glow. The sparks weren't random, but seemed alive, skittering across the shingles like fireflies before vanishing into the cold air. My girlfriend let out a soft gasp, her nails digging into my arm as the creature raised the broom once more. With another thunderous blow, it unleashed a dense cloud of black smoke. The smoke billowed outward, thick and choking, obscuring the figure entirely. For several agonizing seconds, we stared at the roof, waiting, watching as the smoke thinned and drifted away. When it finally cleared, the figure was gone. The roof was empty, save for the faint scorch marks where the sparks had landed. When we finally staggered through the door of her parents' house, the warmth inside was almost suffocating after the biting cold of the night. We were still shaking, our breath shallow, and the words tumbled out of us in disjointed fragments. We described the glowing red light in the forest, the boys' desperate cries, the snowman, and, finally, the monstrous figure on the roof. Her parents listened in silence, their expressions unreadable. When we finished, My girlfriend's mother looked at her father and raised a single eyebrow, a silent conversation passing between them. He set his glass down on the wooden table, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness, and leaned back in his chair. There was no shock, no disbelief, just a calmness that seemed misplaced, even mocking. Given what we had just experienced, it's just Krampus, her father said, his tone casual, the way someone might talk about an unexpected frost or a holiday tradition. He comes every Christmas, that's how it's always been here. His job is to punish the naughty children. He paused to take another sip of his drink, as though the explanation was sufficient, as though his words could make everything we'd seen and felt disappear. My girlfriend and I exchanged a look, equal parts disbelief and frustration. How could they be so calm about something so horrific? When we pressed them for details, they simply shrugged. Her mother murmured that they'd seen him a handful of times over the years, but had never been harmed. He doesn't bother the good, she said with a dismissive wave, her voice so nonchalant it felt like a slap. The conversation left us more unsettled than before. That Blaze attitude, the casual acceptance of a nightmare, felt almost complicit. What did they mean by good? How did they know the boundaries of safety? My girlfriend tried to reason with her parents, asking why no one had warned us, why this wasn't common knowledge. Her father simply shook his head, saying it wasn't something outsiders needed to worry about unless they gave Krampus a reason to notice them. Outsiders. The word hung heavy in the air, sinking into my chest. The unspoken implications churned in my mind, a torrent of questions that had no answers. Later, as we lay in bed, the shadows in the room felt oppressive. The weight of what we had seen, what we had been told, pressed down on me like an iron hand. My girlfriend curled into my side, her breathing uneven, and I tried to reassure her, though I didn't believe the words myself. My eyes stayed fixed on the window, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the dark. It was real. Krampus wasn't just a story or a warning to frighten children into good behavior. It was here, and it had watched us. The thought burrowed deep into my mind, a seed of terror that refused to wither. Somewhere out there, in the silent snow-covered town, it was still walking, still watching. And for the first time in my life, I found myself questioning if being good was ever enough.